I never thought I would find myself standing in the freezing rain outside a dimly lit diner, staring at an empty wallet with a knot of absolute panic tightening in my throat. My name is Clara, and for the past 2 years, since my husband walked out without a word and left me with mounting debt and a toddler to feed, my life had become a relentless exercise in survival arithmetic. That Saturday afternoon, I had walked into the
Just
local
water.
bistro, hoping for a cheap cup of coffee and a warm place to think. But when I opened my wallet and saw nothing staring
Please,
back at me
join me.
except faded
Please
receipts,
join me.
the
There's plenty for
humiliation
both
was
of us.
too heavy to bear. I studied the menu like a complex math problem I knew I couldn't solve, slipped the empty leather pouch back into my coat pocket, and turned around to walk out before the waitress could ask for my order. I thought I had made a clean escape, slipping past the tables with my head held high. But as the heavy glass door swung shut behind me, I heard hurried footsteps crunching against the wet pavement. A man's voice called out, asking me to wait a second. When I turned around, my instincts flared instantly, hardened by months of being pushed around by landlords, collection agents, and men who thought a desperate single mother was an easy target. The man standing before me had a calm, steady gaze, but all I saw was a stranger offering pity, and pride is a very stubborn thing when you have nothing else left. He told me he had ordered too much food and offered to share his table, his voice low and carefully non-threatening. But I didn't want his charity, and I didn't want his look of quiet sympathy. I snapped at him, telling him we were fine, my voice sharp and defensive, before turning on my heel and walking away toward the bus stop as fast as my worn boots could carry me. From behind the delivery trucks and the blur of traffic, I caught a glimpse of him standing alone by the curb, watching me with a look that wasn't judgmental, just deeply, painfully understanding. That brief encounter should have ended right there on the sidewalk, swallowed up by the frantic chaos of my daily routine, but it lingered in my mind like an unresolved chord. Over the next week, the memory of his quiet composure kept surfacing when I least expected it, making me wonder if my fierce independence had just been a wall built out of fear. Walking away from that awkward encounter at the bistro didn't clear my head the way I hoped it would. Instead, it left a dull, nagging ache right behind my ribs that I couldn't shake off. I spent the rest of that evening rushing through my chores, trying to quiet the voice in my head that kept replaying the man's calm, measured words and the way I had practically bitten his head off just because my pride was bruised. By Monday morning, the crushing reality of rent, groceries, and childcare costs pushed the memory completely out of my mind, forcing me back onto the relentless treadmill of trying to keep my family afloat without asking anyone for a handout. My days blurred together in a haze of early mornings, rushing my 6-year-old daughter Chloe to school, working a double shift at the local community center, and lying awake at night calculating numbers that never quite added up. I thought I had successfully locked away that brief moment of humiliation until 2 weeks later, when I decided to take a shortcut through Maple Park during my lunch break to pick up some documents. The autumn air was sharp, and the ground was thick with brown leaves that crunched loudly beneath my boots as I walked past the children's playground. That was when I saw him again, sitting quietly at the far end of a wooden bench with a paperback book resting open on his knee, though he wasn't reading a single word. He was watching a little girl with bright blonde curls pump her legs high on the swings, and the way his shoulders softened made my chest tighten with an unexpected pang of emotion. It took me a few seconds to realize that the little girl on the swing was Chloe, and the absolute panic of a protective mother flared up instantly inside me. My spine stiffened, and my hand dropped immediately to the strap of my bag, ready to grab my things, turn around, and march straight over to demand what he was doing watching my child. But he didn't move toward us, didn't wave, and didn't try to call out. He just kept his eyes fixed gently on his book, turning a page with deliberate slowness as if giving me all the space in the world to decide whether he was a threat or not. Days blurred into weeks, and that quiet park bench became an unspoken testing ground where the distance between us slowly began to shrink without a single word being spoken. He showed up on Tuesdays and Thursdays, sometimes just sitting for 10 minutes before walking away, never crossing the boundary I had unconsciously drawn around myself and my daughter. By the time he finally acknowledged my presence with a respectful nod, the sharp walls of distrust I had built around myself were already starting to crumble, replaced by a strange, unsettling curiosity about who this patient stranger really was. Standing there in the middle of Maple Park with the autumn breeze biting at my cheeks, I tried to process the surreal reality that this quiet stranger was the exact same man who had tried to pay for my coffee weeks ago. When Marcus Reyes walked up to his bench and thanked him for the anonymous help that had kept him afloat during his hardest winter at a local shelter, a cold shock rushed through my veins. I hadn't imagined my pride acting up in that bistro. This man genuinely possessed a quiet, unassuming habit of changing people's lives from the shadows without ever asking for applause. My heart hammered against my ribs as I looked down at the worn cover of the paperback he was holding, suddenly seeing him not as a threat or a pity-monger, but as someone entirely different than anyone I had ever met. A few minutes later, when my daughter Chloe came running over to the bench with wide-eyed innocence and recognized him as the man from the restaurant, my protective instincts flared up again, but his gentle, grounded response completely disarmed me. He didn't try to use my daughter to get closer to me, and he didn't push past my boundaries. He simply introduced himself as Daniel and smiled warmly when Chloe asked him about chicken tenders. That night, after I finally tucked Chloe into bed and sat down at my small kitchen table, I couldn't stop replaying the way he handled himself, realizing that my initial anger had been entirely misplaced. The next day, when Daniel approached me at the park bench and politely asked if we could talk properly without my daughter around, my immediate instinct was to say no and walk away. But something in his steady, honest eyes told me that running away from this conversation would only keep me trapped in the same defensive cycle I had been fighting for years. We agreed to meet the following morning at the exact same bench after I dropped Chloe off at school, and as I walked toward him with a thermos of hot tea, my hands were trembling slightly with a mix of anxiety and unresolved doubt. I sat down at the opposite end of the wooden bench, leaving a careful distance between us. And without wasting a single second, I decided it was time to lay my cards completely on the table. I looked straight out at the river and told him about the exhausting 2 years since my husband walked out, leaving me with zero savings, a massive employment gap, and every door slammed in my face because I was a single mother trying to survive. I told him about Richard Hale, the local business owner who had offered me a lifeline with a flexible job, only to turn that lifeline into a suffocating trap of manipulation, constant demands, and unspoken obligations. My voice stayed level, though my throat felt tight as I explained how walking out of that job had triggered a brutal campaign of retaliation, blacklisting me from every other workplace in the city and forcing us into a crowded family shelter for 4 agonizing months. When I finally looked over at Daniel to see the judgment or the pity I expected, his face showed neither. Instead, he simply nodded with a profound, heavy understanding that took my breath away. Sitting on that park bench across from Daniel, listening to him calmly explain the darkest chapters of his past, I felt the heavy defensive armor I had worn for 2 agonizing years start to crack right down the middle. He didn't offer empty platitudes or pretend that everything was going to magically work out. Instead, he shared his own raw memories of sleeping out of a freezing car in Seattle and washing dishes for 12 grueling hours a day under a boss who treated him with basic human decency when he had nowhere else to turn. He told me about George Miller, the man who taught him that true assistance shouldn't feel like a trap, and how those lessons shaped the way he was trying to approach me without demanding anything in return. I sat there in silence, watching a lone heron lift off the gray surface of the river and bank away toward the distant bridge, realizing that for the first time since my husband walked out, someone was actually listening to my story without trying to rewrite it or use it as leverage. Then Daniel reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out a crisp business card, and laid it gently on the wooden slats between us without pushing it into my hand. He told me his firm needed an administrative assistant to handle scheduling, client correspondence, and file organization, emphasizing with complete sincerity that it was a real, paying job with a formal interview and a proper probationary period, not charity wrapped in a favor. He stood up, told me it was good to officially meet me, and walked away, leaving me staring at that small piece of cardboard as if it held the power to entirely reshape the chaotic trajectory of my life. I didn't call him that afternoon, and I let 3 full days pass while a storm of anxiety, pride, and desperate hope raged inside my head, wondering if taking that step meant walking straight back into a cage. But on the 4th day, with my dwindling cash reserves staring me in the face and the memory of my daughter's trusting eyes pushing me forward, I finally picked up the phone at my kitchen table and dialed the number on the card. When Megan Brooks, the firm's sharp-eyed chief operating officer, put me through to Daniel to schedule the formal interview. My voice shook slightly, but I kept my tone steady as I agreed to be there on Monday morning at 9 sharp. The morning air outside the municipal office building was biting and sharp, but my hands were sweating as I walked through the heavy glass doors for my scheduled meeting with Daniel. Stepping into a corporate office after spending months dodging collection agencies and scraping together rent felt entirely surreal, like putting on a suit of clothes that belonged to a completely different person. Megan Brooks greeted me with a polite, professional nod and led me into a sleek conference room where Daniel was already sitting, a stack of papers neatly squared off in front of him. The interview wasn't a casual chat. It was a rigorous, thorough examination of my administrative skills, my ability to handle high-pressure, multi-time zone scheduling, and my tolerance for sudden chaos. I answered every question with absolute honesty, drawing from the grueling years of managing household budgets down to the last penny and coordinating shelter intake paperwork under impossible conditions. When Daniel asked how I would handle a deliberately flawed logistical scenario he tossed into the mix, I didn't hesitate to point out the hidden trap, matching his gaze with a calm, steady resolve that earned a subtle, approving nod from Megan. At the end of the session, Daniel slid a standard employment contract across the polished wood table, offering a 3-month probationary period with a competitive market salary and full benefits upon permanent transition. He didn't pressure me to sign right away, urging me instead to take the documents home, read every line carefully, and even have someone else look them over if I felt the need. But as I read through the terms and saw the sheer fairness written into every clause, a heavy knot that had been anchored in my chest for years finally began to loosen. I picked up the pen, signed my name with a steady hand, and when Megan offered her hand to welcome me to Carter's Strategic Consulting, I knew I had finally crossed a threshold into a safer, more stable world. Standing in the sterile glow of the hospital corridor, the weight of everything Thomas had just confessed felt entirely overwhelming, pressing down on my chest until it was hard to catch a breath. I had spent the last 2 years building an impenetrable wall of self-reliance, convincing myself that accepting anything from anyone was a dangerous gamble that always came with a hidden price tag. But hearing about my mother's quiet act of compassion from decades ago, something I had never even known about, tore right through my defenses and exposed every raw, insecure place I tried so hard to hide. Thomas wasn't trying to manipulate me, and he certainly wasn't looking for control or power. He was simply a tired, grateful man trying to fulfill a silent promise to a woman who had once saved him from losing everything. Yet, even with that understanding settling deep into my bones, the old fear still lingered like a bitter taste in my mouth, whispering that I didn't know how to accept this kind of grace without feeling like I owed a debt I could never repay. Thomas saw the hesitation written all over my face, and instead of pushing or demanding an answer, he simply stepped back and told me to take all the time I needed to let the truth settle in. He walked away down the quiet hallway toward the loading dock, leaving me standing alone with my thoughts, the prepaid card still heavy in the pocket of my uniform. That evening, after I finally got home and tucked Leo into bed, I sat at the kitchen table for hours, staring at the flickering porch light, replaying every interaction we had shared over the past few weeks. I realized that my stubborn pride wasn't actually protecting me. It was just isolating me, making me push away the exact kind of genuine human connection my mother had spent her whole life building. When my ex-husband dropped off a half-empty envelope of child support the very next afternoon with a careless shrug, the old familiar anger flared up, but this time it dissolved into something much quieter and clearer. I didn't want to live my life waiting for the other shoe to drop, constantly expecting everyone around me to behave like the selfish people from my past. The next morning, I walked straight down to the receiving bay before my shift started, finding Thomas stacking boxes near the freight elevator with his usual quiet diligence. I didn't bring up the groceries or the past debts right away. I just asked him if he wanted to grab a cup of terrible break room coffee with me, matching his steady, unhurried pace. Standing there in the center of the quiet hospital lobby, watching Thomas walk away with his shoulders slightly slumped, I realized how close I had come to letting my stubborn pride sabotage the best thing that had happened to me in years. I didn't chase after him, but I didn't walk away either. I stood my ground, letting the cold reality of my struggles and the genuine warmth of his gesture wash over me until the defensive knot in my chest finally dissolved. Over the next few weeks, things between us shifted from a guarded secret into an honest, unspoken understanding that didn't require constant explanation or heavy obligations. He still dropped off the medical supplies every Tuesday, and we still shared that terrible break room coffee. But the tension was gone, replaced by the comfortable silence of two people who had survived their own private wars and finally found a safe harbor. My ex-husband eventually caught up on a fraction of his back child support, and my hours at the pharmacy stabilized. But the true relief didn't come from the numbers in my bank account. It came from knowing that I didn't have to carry the entire weight of the world on my shoulders all by myself. I started passing on small kindnesses to the new trainees at the hospital, leaving extra snacks in the break room, or offering to cover an extra shift when someone was drowning, keeping the cycle going without expecting anything in return. Looking back on how suspicious I was of those first prepaid grocery cards sitting coldly inside my locker, I can't help but smile at how wrong I was about what kindness actually looks like. It isn't always a grand gesture or a manipulative trap designed to make you feel small. Sometimes it's just a quiet, steady presence left behind by someone who knows what it feels like to be completely forgotten. Thomas didn't swoop in like a hero to save me from my life, and he didn't solve all my problems with a wave of his hand. He simply reminded me that human connection isn't a transaction, and that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is just let someone care.